Today, I am thrilled to welcome Gregor Gimmy, a true pioneer in corporate innovation and the mastermind behind the venture client model, to the Scouting for Growth podcast. Gregor is the founder of 27 Pilots, a company dedicated to helping global corporations build and scale venture client units, a revolutionary approach that enables companies to strategically benefit from startup innovations faster, at a larger scale, and with significantly lower costs and risks than traditional corporate venturing methods. Gregor's journey into innovation is nothing short of inspiring. During his time at BMW, he invented the venture client model and founded the BMW Startup Garage, the world's first venture client unit. This groundbreaking initiative allowed BMW to adopt 10 times more startup technologies than traditional methods, transforming how corporations collaborate with startups. Building on this success, Gregor launched 27 pilots in 2018 to bring this model to companies worldwide, including industry leaders like Airbus, Bosch, and Siemens. Beyond his work with 27 pilots, Gregor is a thought leader, a researcher, and an educator. He's an executive in residence at IMD Business School, a guest lecturer at INSEAD, and a co-author of the first scholarly publication on the venture client model, published and featured in the Harvard Business Review. He is also a sought-after speaker at major conferences like Slash, 4Y, FN, and DLD, where he shares his insights on how corporations can unlock the strategic power and potential of startups. Before getting into our podcast discussion, I would like to set a little bit of context. I would like to dive into some of the statistics from Gregor's recent piece of research on the state of venture clienting. So, companies with venture client units achieve 10 times faster adoption of startup technologies compared to traditional corporate venture capitals or procurement processes. So that is, echoing what I just said around BMW Startup Garage, where Gregor set up the scene. To achieve 10 pilot projects, a corporate venture capital unit would need to invest in 100 startups over 10 to 30 years, while the venture client unit can achieve the same result in a fraction of the time and cost. 75% of companies with venture client units report satisfaction with the quality of startup solutions, compared to only 50% of the companies without such units. Mature venture client units achieve benchmarks such as over 50 pilot purchase order per year for large corporations, adoption quota of over 50% successful integration of startup solutions, and venture capital leveraged of over $500 million per year. So, in today's episode, we will dive deep into the venture client model, exploring how it is reshaping corporate innovation, the strategic benefits it offers, and how companies can adopt this game-changing approach to stay ahead in a competitive world. It's all about differentiation, competitive advantage. It's about really understanding how to change mindset, but we are going to unpack and discover that all. So I'm so thrilled to get deep into this conversation, and let's get to welcome Gregor to the show. Gregor, welcome to Scouting for Growth. Hi, Gregor. Welcome to Scouting for Growth. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's all my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share some of my experiences.
So, well, let's get started with the, very basic question, Gregor. What got you to get into the venture clienting world?
Well, more than getting into the world, I think more than anything, I defined the world because the other worlds of corporate venturing did not meet my requirements. And it was really kickstarted, when I joined BMW in 2012. I came to BMW. I joined the innovation strategy area out of Silicon Valley. Initially, my mandate had nothing to do with startups. Really, it was really, come to BMW. We want to implement the IDEO, design thinking model. You've worked at IDEO. I've worked at IDEO with BMW. Was a client of mine when I worked in Palo Alto, and so help us implement that. And when I got to BMW and I got to know the innovation mechanisms and culture, I was surprised to see the small amount of startups that BMW was leveraging to improve its technology landscape across the entire value chain. And that got me thinking, and that obviously my first approach was to the corporate venture capital guys and say, hey, we need more startups. Because by number, academically, a CVC invests in 2.8 startups per year. A bigger fund, somewhere around 5 or 10 new startups per year over the lifetime of 10 years. And I thought, this is not merely the number we need in order to fill all the technology challenges that we have at the big corporations. And we need more like, 30, 50, 100. So how can I scale? And obviously the initial idea, given that I was working in innovation strategy, was not to invent a new model. It was just basically, let's improve the current model. And so I basically said, why don't we invest in more startups? Why don't we do a micro investment approach, for example, like a Y Combinator, 50,000 at 2% with a standard contract, correct? And here's where I learned, not from the CVC people, but really from the corporate headquarters. They said, look, if we invest in 50 startups per year, that means that in 5 years we will have around 250 startups or companies whose participation or equity stake we have to manage. And that's not possible, right? Because that's a lot of cost. Because even if we don't end up using their technology, we would still be owning their equity. So here's where I immediately came to the conclusion: venture capital is not scalable. It's not even scalable for Sequoia, right? It's scalable for Y Combinator because it has this very specific model, but it's not scalable. But then the second thought was, and that was really the bigger insight, was it doesn't really solve the problem that BMW had in regards to startup technology, right? Problem being access, being able to access and adopt and transfer cutting-edge startup technology fast, right? Because the primary process and methodologies of corporate venture capital are the investment. It's not the technology transfer. And those are two totally different business processes. Think of it like you want to benefit from a BMW car, right? Because you like it, maybe it's a good mobility device, what have you. So what do? Do you buy equity of BMW or you do buy the car? If you buy equity of BMW in the stock market, that's nice, but it doesn't give you access to the car. So you got to buy the car, right? So, and even if you are a shareholder, and especially if you're a minority shareholder of BMW, doesn't give you access to their R&D department either. So being an investor and being a user or client of a company are two totally different business processes. And that's what got me thinking, is that we shouldn't improve the current model, corporate venture capital. We should really look for a new approach. And that's when I thought, at the end of the day, we need to be a venture client, right? I can't just coin the term. But obviously then BMW has been a client of startups for decades. I mean, BMW has been in the Valley, for example, since '97 with its technology office. So BMW has integrated Google technology in its very early days before Google was, big and famous. There are various features in the BMW cars where that were based upon startup technology. But it took BMW 2.5 years to, start some kind of, close on some kind of contract. So what I thought is we have basically two processes, right? We have the investment process, and I think this is just not scalable. And it's extremely expensive and very risky. And on the other hand, we have kind of the typical technology transfer process via purchasing or via M&A. And that, I thought, if I improve this process, it can be scalable. Because BMW has 100,000 suppliers. Why shouldn't they have 100 startups per year, right? So BMW knows how to work with outside companies. And so this is something that can scale. But we need to define a different model, really, of identifying, the right problems, the right startups, the adoption process. And I call that model the venture client model.
That's fascinating. And there are so many things which echo. So I left the corporate world in 2015 and set up my first accelerator with Startup Bootcamp then. And we used to take 5-7% equity in the startup. So imagine today, 2025, I know the pain of managing a portfolio of startups. My team still at Startup Bootcamp is doing that, but you still need to manage the portfolio, the exit, and that costs money and efforts to do that. So absolutely agree with you. The second part is in 2020, after having done, I would say 5 years of acceleration, I said, this is not working. I want to actually commercialize stuff with my insurance partners. And that's where I started also educating myself and testing with them what commercialization meant. So when you look at your creation of the venture client model, Gregor, tell us, how does it differ from traditional venturing approach within the corporation? You already mentioned corporate venture capital, right? CVC and VC, that, taking equity long term is not scalable, right? And then we have seen over the years the corporate innovation labs, right? A lot of corporations have internal labs. So how does the venture client model or the VCM challenging that and differing from it?
Yes. Maybe to set the ground, pillar, let's start with the definition of a venture client, right? So a venture client is a company that adopts startup technologies through procurement and M&A, right? So it's all about the adoption of startup technology so that this technology, fills a gap and basically solves a problem, whether it's an enabling technology for a product or whether it's an enabling technology for a manufacturing or whether it's a whole new business model. Whatever the business challenge is, whenever the startup has a better solution, a solution that the corporate cannot develop faster and better, that's when you become a venture client, and then you just decide whether you want to be the user exclusively through an M&A transaction or whether you want to be a user without a controlling equity stake, and then you basically just enter some kind of supplier relationship, right? So that would be the definition of venture client, and that's very important to notice because often it's understood just as supply chain innovation, right? It's just about, okay, let's find a more innovative supplier. No, it's not about that only. It's really the focus is on the startup, and it's about transferring and adopting the technology through whatever means, whatever, if it's with or without equity. This is really just the adoption strategy, how much control you want to have over the technology from the startup. So how does it differ? Well, first and foremost, accelerators, CVC, are indirect models, right? You basically try to achieve the same thing, right? You say, oh, there's a startup that has a great battery technology. I want access to this technology because it could help. If I put this battery into my cars, I could sell more cars and make my customers happier. It's indirect because the corporate venture capitalist acts as an intermediary. So you approach a startup and say, allow me to invest. The startup says, why? Well, because I want to access to your battery technology, and I will give you access to my engineers who will then be able to incorporate your technology, which is ultimately the goal of your business. But it's indirect because you first do the investment and then you do basically the adoption. So what venture client at the end of the day is just kidding. The difference is cutting out the middleman. You could even say that a corporate venture capitalist is just a bad venture client process. You see many corporate venture capitalists who have big teams that call themselves, partnership teams, for example, right? And those are the teams that basically attempt to achieve a transaction, an adoption of the technology they invested into the parent company, which only happens in 10% of the time. Mm-hmm. And that reason is really because the processes and the resources of a corporate venture capital outfit are really only focused on the equity transfer, not on the adoption. The adoption is a very complex thing to achieve in a corporation, because you deal with many people, right, that need to say yes to a certain technology. Now, the companies spend all their money on setting up a fund. They have little money left to really focus on the work that needs to be done to achieve an adoption. So that's the first big difference: direct versus indirect. And accelerate is also indirect. Because, for example, what a startup bootcamp is doing, what our Techstars are doing is they first try to somehow create the startup, also take equity, and then they basically work 6 months towards some kind of demo day. And the demo day, that's where they meet the venture clients, right, the engineers, and they hope to get a lot of raising hands. And the demo day where the engineer says, "Wow, this is great." Now, again, indirect, right? You first spend 6 months and money on finding and educating startups, then you do basically the big roadshow on a demo day, and then you hope, and basically your KPI is how many engineers. So we cut out, and that was my basic thinking back at BMW. Said, why should I spend money on an accelerator? There is Y Combinator, correct? There are many independent accelerators. I could just go to them and say, look, I have a problem you seem to be able to solve better. And I can go to all the VCs in the world and say, look, I'm a venture client. I have specific capabilities to adopt startup technologies, and here are some of my most pressing problems, or what are some of the startups that you have, and maybe they have solved problems I didn't even think about. And now let's directly work together. So this direct approach really is a big difference. Now, the innovation labs that you mentioned are, depending on how you define them, right? There is certainly a need for a company to build their own companies, right, in a lab, what you call venture building, but only if there is no startup out there. Mm-hmm. Because you cannot compete against a startup. That's the ground truth. A corporate cannot compete against a startup. End of story. A good startup, right? They can compete against 99.9% of startups, because the 99% are just not good enough. But that's millions, right? Yeah. The 0.1% of startups, those are the ones we need to focus on, and those are, a couple 100,000. Those are awesome. You cannot win against them. You cannot win against a Palantir, right? Way back when. You cannot compete against an Oracle in the 80s or 70s, right? When they were started. And here's where the lab is really, and venture clienting are really complementary. So there is a technology challenge. Is there a startup out there with sufficient, or really a market supply of startup technologies with a large supply of venture capital? Then let's approach them, those startups, via our venture client unit. There's not enough venture capital out there. The startups are not competitive. Now we need to really build this ourselves. CVC and accelerator, CVC venture clienting is more of a substitute than a complement. And we see that happening, right? We see CVC units closing and changing towards opening venture client units. And accelerator, I think they still have a justification, but only if you really want to play a role in let's say, fostering the startup ecosystem as a mentor, right? I think it's more, in a way, maybe exaggerated corporate social responsibility than anything else. Like for example, what Wyra is doing in Telefonica, right? It's a lot of fostering startup ecosystem, giving money to the world of entrepreneurs, and then also attempting to achieve some kind of pilot. But there's also the social aspect that often corporates need to take via an accelerator, or can take if they want to, play also a role of fostering the demand. Maybe another important difference is, economically speaking, the venture client is really on the demand side of startups.
Mm-hmm.
And the CVC accelerators are on the supply side.
Yeah.
So the CVC and the accelerator, they're really focused on helping the startup become successful. The venture client is focusing on solving problems. So they really are on the demand side of startups. And that's why it works so nicely, because there's no conflict, right? The CVC also tries to be first on the supply side, creating startups, supporting startups, and then they want to change and become the demand side, right? So you're on the demand and the supply at the same side, and here's where you generate inefficiencies.
Yeah. So a few points you've made, which I think is very important to unpack slightly. Demand and supply, absolutely. And I think when you start working with corporates, what you find is you really need to understand and unpack the requirements and really understand the problem they have they are trying to solve, to actually find the gem, right? The curated gems which are out there, and it's not easy. Second, CVCs. I think it's very important to also explain that VCs is actually supposed to be around financial returns. When you go into CVCs, you have strategic and financial return. And the problem with the strategic component is when you start pushing to the HQ, things you have invested in, it doesn't mean that it fits, because as you say, it's supplying is like, trying to stick a jellyfish on the wall. And so it's very important to understand that demand is really a requirement here to be able to fulfill the need. A little things I wanted to say as well about my accelerator, and that is because I come from industry, is whilst I was working with 30 insurers globally, I made sure that a few of them did, I'm not going to say pilot, but POCs. And I was very fortunate during my 3 months of acceleration to have a lot of insurers doing POCs to learn to collaborate, but you could not do that at scale. So that's why the venture client model becomes really critical. So can you explain some of the core principles of the venture client model? And some of the challenges maybe also you face when you were at BMW, which which you were able to solve by refining your approach.
So core principles. Well, first we need to emphasize, I want to emphasize that you can be a bad venture client. You can be very bad client, right? So you can also create a very bad venture client model, just like you can have a very bad business model, or you can have a very bad investment model. I want to invest 1% in your company, but I want to have exclusive right to, XYZ, right? So there's a lot of things you can do wrong in a model. So venture client per se is just, you need to focus on defining or using a model that actually works. And some of the principles that really help define that framework correctly are, first and foremost, it's a model where you position the company as the user of startup technology. I've seen, for example, companies that say, well, I want to do venture clienting because my technology is great for startups. I have whatever microchips, and wouldn't that be nice if startups would start using my microchip? Well, this has nothing to do with venture client. You are got to be a user of startup technology. That's a basic thing. And it's also not about collaboration. It's about using. we got to get rid of that word collaboration, because collaboration is then a tool to achieve the usage, but it's not even a necessary tool. I mean, how many companies are using OpenAI and then never collaborated with them, right? You don't need to set up a common project with OpenAI. You just need to punch in your credit card number, right? And so position yourself as a user. Second important principle is understand startups as a resource for competitive advantage, not just innovation, right? Because that really totally changes the approach to startups, because now you can start looking for startups that provide you a better technology for logistics, right? Which is an innovation because you're changing something, but from the corporate perspective, that's not the innovation department, right? So if at BMW somebody wants to improve a sensor in logistics in order to, I don't know, do faster picking of some spare parts, this person is, the efficiency guy, and it obviously is doing something new, but he's not the innovation department.
Yeah.
He doesn't have access to the innovation budget. Innovation, but by defining startup a resource for competitive advantage, also has another big advantage, because now the company will never discuss or question why we should do venture clienting, because now it becomes a tool for competitive advantage rather than a tool for innovation. Because often companies would say, well, these are not the times to innovate, right? We need to focus on something else. But nobody questioned these are not the times to become more competitive.
Yeah.
Right? And so it gives you, as using that principle really gives you the advantage of generating much more resources and attention, awareness for the value of the venture client model. A third principle is it has to be problem driven, not solution driven. And often, for example, the old approach, for example, we do scouting right around the world. This is solution driven. I find a solution and I try to push this into my company. Venture client principle always needs to be problem driven. It doesn't mean that you have to identify all the problems. I mean, that's part of the process, is that you as a company identify your problems and you're able to distinguish between those problems that you need to solve yourself and those that need to be solved by startups. That's complex, right? So pretty good. But you can also approach startups with a problem perspective. For example, if you find a startup at Slush that has an interesting technology, your question is, what problem does it solve? And is that a relevant problem, rather than going to your company and saying, look, I found this solution. Why don't you use it? Because it's a great startup. So the mindset is all very problem driven, even though the problem can also be defined directly or indirectly by the startup itself or the venture capitalist, because ultimately they also invest and create companies focused on problems. And maybe a fourth important principle is the venture client is the key decision maker across really the main decision points. And the venture client is the end user of the startup technology. And the end user is not the CEO. The CEO does not decide on startups,
No.
right? It's the engineer, right? It's a business unit. It's a middle management, often maybe even lower, right? It's the people who have the expertise about a certain function, about a certain project, a product, what have you. And they're the ones who ultimately need to make a decision whether they build a technology or buy technology or acquire a company in order to have full control over that technology. And what we often have seen in the past is that, for example, in corporate venture capital, the user of the startup technology provides a feedback but doesn't make a decision, right? You don't you don't even sit on the table because that would be the table wouldn't be big enough, right? So really the venture client needs to be the decision maker on the relevance of the problem. They need to be the decision maker on the relevance of the business case behind. They need to be the decision maker on whether they should pilot a startup. They need to be the decision maker whether they want to do an adoption strategy with or without controlling equity. Correct. That's really the driving force, and the process needs to be focused on those individuals rather than on a centralized committee that defines a problem. So those would be some of the principles that I find really helpful in order to make a really powerful venture client model.
Yeah, as I listen to you, Gregor, I'm thinking of my Japanese partners. I'm also an ambassador for Tokyo, to bring European innovation into Tokyo. And one thing they said to me is, at the end of the day, Sabine, the way decisions are made in the Japanese business is at the engineering level. It's the person who is using the technology who has to make the choice. So it's bottom up. So I love hearing that. But I want to highlight the four things you mentioned, right? Problem driven first. Then second, we need to actually identify usage. And I've made the mistake. I talk about collaboration and partnership. So user first is about usage. Then how we drive competitive advantage, and then reverse, right? We need to really understand whose problem we are solving for.
Mm-hmm.
So any challenge, I assume your core principle come from the challenges in what you have tested, right? Iteratively tested at BMW and with all the clients you have worked with over the years. Any 2 or 3 key challenges you've seen that other corporates need to really pay attention to as they actually look at venture clienting?
You mean challenges regarding the model?
Challenges regarding what they are doing already internally vis-a-vis them trying to implement the model.
So you mean challenges in regards to startup, to technology gaps, where they would be looking into the startup world, or would you mean challenges in regards to how do I achieve to set up a structure so that venture clienting really works well in my company?
The latter, because over the past 3 days, we had an interesting roundtable. And when I think, corporate startup engagement has been running, as you say, for 10 years, I've realized that despite having, over probably 70, 75 people, different companies in the room, still today, they have major challenges to make this right. So the latter question.
Well, first and foremost, I've never had the luxury to be invited to the venture client roundtable, but what I see when I look at the people that went to the venture client roundtable is that they are probably not the right people to implement the venture client model. They're just too low in the hierarchy. And the venture client model needs to be implemented in a hybrid mode. It needs to be top down, bottom up. So the innovation manager who calls himself now or herself, I'm the venture client manager, and I go to the venture client route and say, oh, I've been doing a collaboration with startups for 5 years, and this is just changing the label, but not the wine. Right? And that's what's happening often in business, right? You change the bottle, but not the wine, right? And so what needs to happen, and that's really a key challenge, is first and foremost, the company on the very top level needs to define startups as a relevant competitive resource.
Mm-hmm.
If this doesn't happen, venture clienting won't work, right? You won't be good at sports if you don't have the personal intrinsic conviction that sports is fun.
Yeah.
Right? And the company, if venture clienting is a tool to adopt startup technologies, obviously as a company, there needs to be a strategy on the very top level that says startups are relevant, because startups provide critical technology. It's not like, oh, I help you fix your coffee machine, right? So first and foremost. Second, now the top management, and I'm here really saying CEO, says, oh, startups are a relevant resource to remain competitive in the future. Now, what vehicle do I need for that? Right? And here's obviously where they through some process, right, come to the conclusion that the venture client model is the right approach. And I've seen this various times happen, and this is really when it worked best. In the past, obviously, they called up McKinsey, and McKinsey said you need to implement CVC, right? They charged them 10 million just to do a CVC strategy, right? 10 million down the drain, right? So we need them, obviously, we need to, once through whatever process, the C-level comes to the conclusion that the venture client model is the right way to go. Now, the next step here would be, and it's, how do I achieve that, right? How do I set up that unit? And what we're seeing today is that either they do it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine. I did it myself at BMW, right? But that obviously means you're trying to become very proficient at golf without a golf trainer. You're trying to be very proficient at tennis without a tennis trainer.
Yeah.
It'll take you a little bit more time to win Wimbledon, right? If you just start from scratch. Now, I started from scratch because there was nobody out there. But today there is, some companies who have experience. Obviously, among those companies, also some that claim to have done a lot of venture clienting, they really haven't. But as a company now, you really need to start looking into bringing in the best experts and you do your homework on their experience in order to make sure that they're really implementing best practices into your company. There also needs to be, and that's also a challenge, is that sometimes it's misunderstood that, well, I do some venture clienting and I prove that it works, and then I'll get more budget. No, this is wrong. This is selling bottom up, and this will take you 20 years, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you are not in the right hierarchical position. The mindset, and that needs to really come top down, is to say, look, we think that startups are important competitive resource. We think that the venture, because at the end of the day, it's about adoption of startup technology, so a venture client model. And now let's just make it work. And if it doesn't work with that person, it has to work with a different person, right? It's not this, oh, let's see if it works. It's, I have to make it work. End of story. Because what alternative do I have? Investment? No, because it's indirect. Accelerator? Well, it's also indirect. Different, like building, mentoring, the Techstars approach kind of. Yep. So there can be multiple venture client models. I just need to find the right ones, and I need to have a mindset on the top level that this is going to take you from somewhere around 3 to 5 years to get it institutionalized. Institutionalized meaning to really have the venture client model functioning and being embraced by the culture. There is a main challenge that I see is that companies fail to make it really a distinct, clearly differentiated unit, right? So if you want to be great at design, what do? You set up design department. Yeah. You want to be great at marketing, you have a marketing department. You don't want to be great at marketing, well, you have a guy sitting in sales who does some marketing and pricing, and maybe you just go out to an external advertising agency and you do some marketing, right? Or some advertising. If you want to be great at something, you got to have your internal core competencies, and you cannot create core competencies without dedication. And dedication means a team of capable managers that either have experience in venture clienting at this point, 10 years into venture clienting. There are, many people who have done the work and who have experience, or you train them correctly, right? But in any event, it has to be a dedicated team, because obviously anything else would not be coherent with your very first, let's say, thinking or decision, which was startups are relevant. If startups are relevant for your competitive advantage and you don't have a dedicated unit, then you're contradicting yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. And actually, a question that comes often, Gregor, is, how big should my team be? I mean, as I'm listening to you and saying, you need to have a venture clienting unit.
Yes.
The first question people ask me is, how many people do I need in that unit? Does that matter? Does size matter?
Oh, yeah, definitely. What we have seen works best is in organic growth with a big vision. So the big vision in a big corporate is plus 100 startups per year.
Mm-hmm.
Most corporates say, oh my God, nobody has time for 100 startups. We're happy if we have 5, right? This is the old thinking. And people don't have time, and they cannot work with startups. That's all the wrong thinking. It's all the old thinking. The right thinking is, how big is my startup gap? And the startup gap is defined as which of the technology challenges that I have, if solved, they give me a competitive edge. How many of those technology gaps can be better filled by startups? And given that startups exist to fill technology gaps, the good ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no VC who would give money to a startup where the startup says, well, I'm doing this, but BMW can do it by itself, right?
No.
Right? So the very first question is, what can you do that Google, Apple, BMW, Zurich Insurance, or who have you cannot do, right? That's the very first filter before venture capital flows. So we need to take that thinking and that truth of the startup ecosystem and then ask ourselves, how many technologies are we missing, or we're just using obsolete technologies? And in a big corporation, you easily reach 1,000 or more.
Yeah.
Wherever you look, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's obviously, you go into any department and say, there's always, technology that can help you with more efficiency, with more, with speed and so on. So if you're now, let's say your startup gap is way beyond 100 per year, don't start with trying to solve 100 problems per year. That would require a team of, 10, 20 plus people. You need to, for interclienting to work, it needs to be set up in a way that not only is there a process, but there's also obviously education, a mindset shift, there's roles and responsibilities, right? And you better start growing this organically with a small team. My answer is always, your first initial team should be at least 3 people, but then you can grow beyond 30, 40, 50, because you will then scale and grow this team based upon the KPIs, the impact you're generating, and we'll see that, the more people I put, the more problems I solve, the more money I can make in terms of profits or revenue because of great startup technologies.
That's super. I spent some time reading your recent research, State of Venture Clienting, and I guess the URL is State of Venture Client, so that people know if they are going to look for the report. And I read that 74% of companies have transitioned from informal startup collaboration to establishing direct venture clienting units based on your research. So, can you tell us more about this adoption and the shift which is currently happening around the world? I think I read 195 companies. I know there's many more Fortune 500 than 195, but it's still a good start, isn't it, Gregor?
Well, if BMW is labeled as the first venture client unit, then looking back now or 10 years, um, it's impressive how it has grown and spread also across the world, as far as Japan or as far as Chile, right? Um, and what really becomes more and more obvious to companies and top managers is really that very obvious business truth, which is if you want to be good at something, you need a dedicated unit, right? If you do it part-time, it will just work partly, right? And if you don't put the best team, being the smart people, but everybody in the company is smart, right? They wouldn't be hired, but they need to be trained, they need to have the right resources. And in a unit setting, it's just very different, right? You can do venture clienting as just let's say as a method, right? Just like design thinking. Design thinking is a method. You can apply it in every department, right? Venture clienting, you can also just apply as a method, but you can also really make it a department. And as you make it a department, something changes, right? First and foremost, you have more time you can dedicate to it. You have a dedicated budget. You have a more solid KPI structure. So it changes from personal objectives. Oh, you're the venture client dude in the innovation department, and here are some personal objectives, and those are the KPIs, right? If it becomes a unit, now certainly an organizational unit has KPIs. That's totally different. It's much stronger, right? You become more recognized inside the company. That's critical, right? So you're not any longer Jane or Joe who walks around the company and says, I'm the startup person, the venture client person. It's like I am the manager or the head or part of this venture client unit, which by the way has endorsement of the CEO. We've been set up in order to leverage the resource startup for our company to achieve competitive advantages that we couldn't achieve without it. So this is a totally different story than running around just and saying, "Oh, I have a certificate in venture clienting, and I will help you identify your problem," right?
Yeah.
And lastly, being a department, a unit, really also gives you much more leverage, on changing and implementing new processes across the company, right? So you say, okay, for example, just something as simple as an NDA. The venture client unit has its own NDA, which is obviously aligned with central legal. But if you are Jane or Joe, venture client with a venture client certificate, it'll be harder for you to just say, okay, this is a new purchasing process, this is a new NDA process, this is a new M&A process, this is a new licensing process, correct? Because we need different processes for startups because we cannot apply what we apply to incumbents to startups. So I think companies are realizing this. They're also realizing this first and foremost, obviously from activities where they meet other venture clients, and also the world of academia is starting to publish more about this and making it more obvious to companies that, yeah, this is something that has the importance, but also the complexity that really justifies setting up a unit. And maybe that's the last comment here, is obviously if you are a 100-person company, you wouldn't set up a venture client unit.
Yeah.
Just like you in a small company, you do IT, maybe you don't have an IT department, right? But you have somebody who knows about IT, right? So, but especially when you go beyond 500 million or billion in revenue, that's when your company is so complex that the adoption process of startup technology really can be made more efficient through a venture client unit.
Yeah, I love hearing what you are saying, Gregor. And the key here is really understanding it needs to be a separate unit within a large corporation, populated with the right people. So we are hearing leadership needs to be aligned, culture and mindset needs to be changed, supported by the right process. And then gradually we iterate and experiment to actually find the right sweet spot for the unit itself within the group. Because at the end of the day, if it's done right, it drives differentiation and competitive advantage and
Mhm.
allow a business to move faster, hopefully, than competition.
Mhm.
Instead of building things internally, organization use technology which is out there to
Mhm.
succeed. So
Mhm.
let's talk about some of the benefits, right? I want to tackle benefits with you before ending this conversation. And some of the stat I saw in your research is companies with a venture client unit achieve 10 times faster adoption of startup technology compared to traditional models. So
Mhm.
what makes venture client units so much more efficient, and how do they overcome the bottleneck of traditional models?
Mhm. Well, we touched on that already before, that really this 10x, and it's probably more, when we look at the KPIs today that venture client units achieve, and if I put them next to the CVC units. So for example, if a CVC unit on average, academic average is at 2.8, big CVC units are looking at 5 to 10 startup investments, right, per year, 5 to 10. We're looking at 50, 75, 100, not, and those are already, let's say, adoptions that are happening, right? If you do an investment, 10% of that will be some kind of adoption, right? So it's probably beyond 10x. Well, the it's really all based and all dependent on on this model, on the model you implement. You have a client model where you, with the wrong process, with the wrong team, it will probably be worse than anything else, right? It will be worse than corporate venture capital, right? So this is really what will be the driver of let's say breakthrough effectiveness. And also, the fact that you're really disintermediating the process makes this, because you're just much more direct. That's also what adds obviously this great efficiency. The other point is you're liberating a lot of resources, especially if you've done CVC before, that you can now channel into venture clienting, right? So that also is a factor behind driving a 10x improvement. And maybe another very important factor that drives this is the quality of the startup will suddenly improve. If you are a CVC, for example, the truth is that you cannot invest in every startup you want,
Yes,
right? Same happens for Sequoia, right? Or Benchmark or Kleiner Perkins or
absolutely.
Index. So it doesn't happen with venture clienting. That's an interesting. So
It is
there's no
interesting.
limit in the quality of startups you can bring in, and given that the quality of the startup ultimately is what drives adoption, because if a startup is bad, adoption won't work, right? A corporate does not improve a startup. A startup needs to improve the corporate, right? So, um, and the funny thing is, in the old venturing world, there's some kind of a paradox, right? The better the startup, the less the tool works, right? It doesn't matter whether you're Google or BMW, and most are not BMW or Google. The better the startup, the lower the chances that you are allowed to invest, right?
Interesting.
Because they're
Interesting.
oversubscribed, right?
Yeah.
Now, try investing in OpenAI, right?
Yes.
So my statistics say that even very, global, well-branded corporates, they are CVCs, they are allowed to invest in 3 out of 10. So venture client doesn't have this problem because the client is king.
Yeah.
Oh, I've been invested by, I don't know, Audi. Well, I cannot accept investment from BMW, right? So you're out of the game. Oh, Audi's buying my technology. You're welcome to buy my technology too, right? Unless it's exclusive, but then you already have been acquired, right? By another company that says, oh, I want to be the exclusive client or user of this technology. So I think this is really ultimately, given that there is no limitation to the amount of clients a startup can have, it's actually it's really an essential growth factor for the startup to have many, many clients, right?
Yes.
It's not essential for the startup to have many, many investors,
Correct.
especially in the hundreds, right? Every investor is cost, every investor is pain, every investor is management fees, correct? It's attention, it's board struggling, is, oh, let's see in the next round. So for a startup, the investor, no matter if your name is Sequoia, you're the necessary evil, right? Because you're giving away equity and you're having somebody breathing up your neck. Obviously,
Yes.
give you a lot of money for it. So it's a pact with, in a way, with, it's a necessary evil, right? The client is what you found your company for, at least if you're a good entrepreneur, right? You found the company, you start up because you think that you can do good to your market that you couldn't do without founding this company. And so the more the better, right?
Yeah.
So this is really what drives those huge KPIs. No limit to the quality of startups you can access. And we have seen now that top startups suddenly start, they have no problems working with venture clients who are not BMW. They're small companies out of nowhere, nobody knows them, and startup says, wow, it's a new client, awesome, right?
Yeah.
Oh, and they can make fast decisions. They don't screw with my IP. They don't come with some kind of investment obligations or rights or conditions or options. Wonderful, right? It's one more client, right? So here's where the venture client model is really it really drives its core value.
Yeah, and that works for B2C as much as B2B. So my last question, because I want to be respectful of your time, Gregor, and I would have loved to actually ask you much more question, and maybe we'll need to set up another podcast in the near future, is how do you see the venture client model evolving in the next 5 years to 10 years? And what industry do you think will win and benefit from it in the future?
Well, I see that all companies will practice venture clienting, small and large. Today, corporate venture capital is implemented by only 5% of companies with more than $1 billion in revenue. It's very small. I mean,
So,
if you read PitchBook and all the reports, it sounds like everybody is doing corporate venture capital. No, even the large enterprises plus $1 billion, it's only about 5% that have a dedicated venture. So I see that as an important trend. Then to me, venture clienting and venture client model will displace corporate venture capital. And it becomes really the standard of corporate venturing. If you today Google define corporate venturing, you often get, Harvard Business School definition, which is, a minority investments in startup with the objective to obtain a strategic benefit or an innovation from a startup. Now, this will change. I think in 10 years, when you Google corporate venturing, the venture client model will pop up,
yeah.
basically this problem-driven, this user-driven approach rather than the investment-driven approach. Another important trend, this will be also a game changer, is a strong interaction and collaboration between the independent venture capitalist and the venture client.
Mm-hmm.
Today, there's little communication. Why? Let's say between the demand and supply side, right? The demand side, the venture client knows problems, especially with the venture client unit, they have a big database of complex problems. And many of those won't even be financed in the venture capital world. Why? Because the venture capital world doesn't know about them.
Yeah.
So this interaction, collaboration between the VC world, the venture capital world, and the venture client world will happen, will be ever stronger. We already see that companies like Andreessen Horowitz, Sequoia, they're contacting directly the venture client units. But at this point, more for kind of a sales effort, right? I have this portfolio of startups. Would you like to, buy their technologies or acquire them? It will evolve into let's share problems. If you share your problems with me, I can direct my money towards those types of solutions. This will save you money on your side. I will have my financial benefit. You will have your strategic benefits. So everybody wins. This will be a very important trend, and this will also add another, let's say, boost to really the startup ecosystem itself.
Mm-hmm.
Today is already the strongest innovation ecosystem, but now that there is a stronger interaction between the demand side and the supply side, the venture client and the venture capitalist and the startup, less conflict, more information exchange. It will lead to better investments. It will lead to bad startups being identified and filtered out faster. And so overall, the ecosystem will grow and will gain in quality. And in terms of which markets, I really don't see any market that today can achieve sustainable competitive advantage without technology.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's a small bakery around the corner or whether it's the large corporate, whether it's about technology in your product or whether it's about technology for the environment or for many technology just plays such a critical role across the entire value chain today. I would say that technology is becoming even more important than the CEO, right? Imagine a car company that has a battery that can charge in 3 minutes, how much impact that would have on the stock price compared to, oh, I just hired a new CEO, right? Yes, if it's a good CEO, everybody will love it, but oh wow, those guys now have a cutting edge technology nobody has. That's really what's boosting. So technology is such a critical factor for competitive advantage. And given that startups are at the forefront of inventing the technologies of the future, because that has been the case for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and it will remain so in the future ever even more. Here's where I don't see really any limit. I really see venture clienting democratizing corporate venturing in a way that has never been thought being possible before.
Yeah. And would you have one or two last advice for the startup, the scale-ups who are looking at the model now to start scaling faster their business model?
Well, my advice to startups, first and foremost, look out for the good venture clients and focus on good rather than just the venture clients, because I foresee that many companies will say, oh, I'm also a venture client, but they haven't really changed anything inside. So it's just the bad client like they have been before. So look out for good venture clients. That's my first advice. And second, go to UVC, go to the influencers in your market and speak about your need for interacting with good venture clients. Think of it like, let's say, the war for startups, right? Or the war for talent, right? The war for talent is, oh, I'm looking for a company that gives me XYZ, that had XYZ infrastructure, strategies, resources, what have you, for me as a person to grow and to be successful at that company. So same thing with startups. If you go out and for example, you talk to your index, whoever your investor is, right? You should also pray and evangelize venture clienting to the CEOs that you meet. For example, imagine an Index or Andreessen Horowitz, if they would go out to the CEOs of the world and say, show me your venture client unit.
Yes.
What? You don't have one? Or what? It's just 3 people? I mean, how can you engage with my startups? I'd rather send them to another company, right? This is really when venture clienting will become more and more mainstream. And so that would be some advice I would give to startups. Participate in demanding that corporates invest in setting up good venture client structures. Also, be honest with yourself when you look at corporate funding. I had a very good startup, founded by some Harvard professors, really, really strong startup. They asked me the following questions. Will BMW buy more of my technology if I allow them to invest? And I said, no, because the investor doesn't make the purchase order, not even the CEO. It's the engineer, and the engineer needs to decide, not based upon equity ownership, they need to decide of whether it makes BMW better.
Yeah.
And that's really, so don't when you look at CVC, right, really think about, is that really a direct impact on your growth, or is it just a promise to generate some kind of impact? Why, if you're just using selling a minority stakes in your company as some kind of a marketing or PR activity, oh, they invested. No, your best marketing, your best PR will be saying BMW is my client, not BMW is my investor.
I so much believe in that. And I love the statement of corporate, open the kimono, show me all your venture clients from an investor viewpoint. And then we will see whether we can recommend some of our companies in our top portfolio. So that is amazing. Gregor, if people want to find you, want to actually speak with you, where should they go?
Well, they can find me always on LinkedIn and or gregorgimmy.com, kind of like my website, which is obviously still very, very basic now that it's just been a few days since I left Horizon Pilots. But easiest, find me over LinkedIn and contact me there. And I'd be happy to speak with startups, with corporates, academics who are interested in who are doing a master thesis or PhD, or professors who want to teach a course about it or have me as a guest lecturer. LinkedIn at this point is a great channel to connect with me.
Yeah, I will introduce you to Professor Gianvito Lanzola. I do a course with him at Bayes Business School once a year on synthesis or disruption from fintech startups. And I am sure he would love to talk to you. So, Gregor, thank you so much for joining me on Scouting for Growth. And I look forward to inviting you again, probably next year, to see where the state of venture clienting is going in 2025 to 2026. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for very deep and thought through, questions. It's been a pleasure talking to you and looking forward to talking more and beyond even this podcast.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Scouting for Growth. Please subscribe, share with friends, and leave a 5-star rating. Your rating is so valuable. I review all of them, and my team help me adapt content to meet your needs. Also, connect with me on my preferred channels. I am a B2B growth expert, so you will find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Threads, and X as well as Blue Sky. All information available below. Until next, keep scouting for growth.